Just before midnight on March 25, 1971, the Pakistani army launched a coordinated crackdown across Dhaka, moving first on university dormitories. Before dawn, they'd arrested the region's elected political leader and declared his party illegal. A name for what happened next didn't take long to arrive on either side. One government still calls it a war for national unity. The other calls it, in its own constitution, a genocide. And the two sides can't agree on the death toll to within a factor of 100. In 1947, British India was partitioned into two countries. Pakistan was created as one state in two pieces, separated by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, joined mainly by a shared religion and very little else. West Pakistan held the capital, the military high command, and most federal spending. East Pakistan, though home to the majority of the new country's population and a majority of its export earnings, held neither. When East Pakistan's Awami League won an outright parliamentary majority in the country's first free general election in December 1970, talks over transferring power collapsed. A 9-month war followed, ending in Pakistan's surrender in December 1971 and the creation of Bangladesh. On the war's central fact, there is no agreement at all. Bangladesh's official death toll is 3 million. Pakistan's own military inquiry, kept classified for decades, put its estimate at roughly 26,000. 1952, Pakistani police kill Bengali language protesters in Dhaka, demanding recognition of Bengali as a state language, a date Bangladesh still marks as a founding grievance. Through the 1960s, resentment builds over the concentration of federal spending and military power in the country's western wing. December 1970, the Awami League, led by Sheikh Hamoodur Rahman, wins 160 of 162 East Pakistani seats, enough for an outright national majority, and the ruling government in the West stalls on convening parliament. March 25, 1971, the Army launches Operation Searchlight, a coordinated crackdown on Dhaka University, the police, and Awami League leadership. Sheikh Mujib is arrested hours after a declaration of independence goes out in his name. Over the next 9 months, millions of refugees cross into India, and a Bengali guerrilla force, the Mukti Bahini, wages an insurgency. December 3, 1971, Pakistan launches preemptive airstrikes on Indian air bases. India enters the war directly on the Bengali side. December 16, 1971, Pakistan's Eastern Command surrenders in Dhaka, with 93,000 soldiers taken prisoner, one of the largest surrenders since World War II. 1974, under a tripartite agreement between India, Pakistan, and the new Bangladesh, all 93,000 prisoners are repatriated to Pakistan without any international war crimes trial. Decades later, in 2009, Bangladesh sets up its own domestic tribunal, which goes on to try and execute several Bangladeshi collaborators, but no Pakistani military officer ever. For Bangladesh, this was never simply a civil war or a secession. Its own constitution and national memory describe March 25, 1971 as the start of a genocide, launched specifically to crush a Bengali national identity that Pakistan's Western elite had spent 2 decades trying to erase, starting with the attempt to impose Urdu over Bengali as the state's only language. Operation Searchlight's first targets in Bangladesh's account weren't random. Dhaka University's dormitories, specifically chosen Hindu neighborhoods, and Bengali intellectuals, writers, and professors were killed in disproportionate targeted numbers in a campaign Bangladesh's government has formally asked the world to recognize as genocide on its own terms, distinct from and larger than ordinary wartime casualties. December 16th is celebrated every year as Victory Day, and Sheikh Hamoodur Rahman is remembered officially as Bangabandhu, friend of Bengal, the father of a nation that in this telling simply refused to disappear. Pakistan's own account, laid out at the time in a government white paper, framed the March 1971 crackdown as a response to what it called an armed uprising already being organized by the Awami League against a united Pakistani state. Not the suppression of an election result, but the prevention of a secession it believed was actively being planned, with encouragement from India. Pakistan's government did commission its own inquiry, the Hamoodur Rahman Commission, which documented serious abuses by its own army and recommended courts-martial for named officers. But the report was classified for nearly 3 decades, and its recommendations were never carried out. To this day, Pakistan disputes Bangladesh's 3 million figure as a wartime propaganda number with no basis in its own investigation's evidence, while largely treating the war's outcome not as a domestic reckoning still owed, but as a state broken apart by Indian military intervention in what Pakistan still describes as an internal political crisis. Here's the number that outlasts the argument over 3 million versus 26,000. Zero. 0 Pakistani military officers were ever tried anywhere for what happened in 1971. Pakistan's own commission named specific officers and recommended courts-martial. The report stayed classified. 93,000 prisoners of war, including the men most senior in the chain of command, were handed back to Pakistan in 1974 under a diplomatic agreement with immunity from prosecution built into the deal. The only war crimes tribunal that Bangladesh ever actually ran, decades later starting in 2009, tried Bangladeshis, local collaborators accused of assisting the Pakistani army. Not a single Pakistani soldier. The country whose own investigators wrote down the names never held a single trial. The country that eventually held trials could only reach the people who never left. Last episode asked what admitting a fact actually costs a government if nothing legal follows from it. This one asks a harder version. Whose trial actually happens seems to depend less on whose commission wrote the names down and more on who's still reachable years later to stand in a courtroom. Bangladesh and Pakistan can't agree on how many people died in 1971 and may never fully reconcile those numbers. But both governments' own paper trails agree on something neither one advertises. The people a war's own investigators identified as responsible and the people who eventually answered for it in a courtroom were never the same people. A 9-month war, a death toll that 2 governments still can't agree on within a factor of 100, and 93,000 prisoners of war who went home without ever standing trial. Next time, we go back more than a century to a private colony ruled by one European king personally, not his country, him, where the profits came from rubber and the bill came due in severed hands.